Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar, Doing Equitable Leadership in the Arts with Vincent Silk. My name is Laura and it's really excellent to be joined by Vincent today for this important conversation and actually the last webinar in our current series. I would like to start by warmly acknowledging the traditional owners of countries throughout Australia, including where you are today. I come to you from Gadigal land in the Eora Nation and I pay my deep respect to elders past, present and future and extend that respect to any First Nations people joining us today. If you would like, please share an acknowledgement of the country you are joining us from today in the chat. Currently on screen there is a blue PowerPoint slide with text and video boxes with our guest speaker and Auslan interpreter. I am a woman in my mid-30s. I'm fair-skinned with blue eyes and dark brown hair. Today I'm wearing a navy shirt and I'm sitting in my study at home in Marrickville. Welcome to Creative Connections. In a minute I will introduce you to our guest for today's session, Vincent, to talk to us about how we might engage and reflect in equitable leadership and practice. Today marks the last session in our current series of Creative Connections and it is our 40th session since we began at the start of April, a time that now feels so long ago. The past few months have been a whirlwind of constant change and upheaval, and these sessions have been designed to provide support, resources and guidance to manage and respond to the changes and an opportunity to take some time out to reflect and reconsider our futures. I know many people have reached screen capacity, but the recordings of each of these sessions are published on our website and are a great resource to come back to if you need. We are lucky to have been joined by so many incredible guests working in and around our sector, and this time has shown the strength of our community. I thank you all for joining us and coming together to support each other as we continue to navigate these uncertain times. Before I hand over to Vincent, I just want to go through a couple of the housekeeping and features of today's webinar. I'm sure you're all very well versed in Zoom, but live captioning is available. You can turn it on by pressing the CC button at the bottom of the Zoom window and also pull out the full transcript. Thank you to Alicia and Bettina for joining us as Auslan interpreters today. We will be running a chat throughout today's session and we invite you and encourage you to share any ideas, thoughts and resources with us. Frances will be looking after the chat and will share any relevant links with you as we go through the session. We'll also be running a Q&A with Vincent at the end of today's session. So if you have a question for Vincent, you can add it to the Q&A section at the bottom of the Zoom window. We'll do our best to get to as many as we can. And if we run out of time, you can always send us an email at leadershipprogram@australiacouncil.gov.au and we will get back to you. If you are having any tech issues or something isn't working, you can use the raised hand feature and Frances from our team will be in touch with you to try and resolve it. And finally, we are recording today's session as with each session, and these are available on our website. Please share them with anyone you think might be interested. As this is our last session of Creative Connections, I would like to encourage you to complete a short survey to provide your feedback on the series. Your feedback ensures we can continue to create programs that directly respond to your needs, and we're really keen to hear your thoughts. We will share the link to the survey in the chat now, and it'll only take a couple of minutes. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our guest for today. Currently on screen is a blue PowerPoint slide. There is an image of Vincent. He is a fair-skinned man with short brown hair. He is wearing a white t-shirt and looking directly at the camera. The image is shot in grayscale. Vincent Silk is a writer. His work can be found in several review of books, Runway, Magazine and Archer, among other places. In 2018, he published his first novel, Sisters of No Mercy, through Brio Books. Vincent has spent the last decade involved in community organising, with a particularly large chunk of that time spent as a facilitator and organiser of Undercurrent Victoria's community education project, focused on prevention of violence and sexual assault. Much of Vincent's work in this area has involved bringing together creative practice and critical understandings of power. I also want to acknowledge that Vincent is joining us today from Melbourne, and our thoughts are with anyone in Melbourne facing really challenging times in lockdown at the moment. Today, Vincent will invite us to engage with and reflect on the power structures that exist and our place within them, not only in our sector, but in our everyday world. He will encourage us to reflect on the hierarchies inherent in the systems by which we live and work, and challenge us to consider the steps we can all take in our leadership and our work to address these imbalances. Vincent brings his experience of working in community support and development to the arts and to us today. I have had the pleasure of knowing Vincent and his work for some time, and he creates safe spaces to have difficult conversations and encourages us to actively participate in these conversations and seek out our own opportunities for creating a safer and more equitable future for everyone. This is such an important session to end with, and I hope that we can all take some of these provocations and reflections with us today back to our workplaces and communities. Throughout the sessions, we'll share resources with you in the chat, and if anything comes up for you personally, we encourage you to look at these resources and seek support. Thanks so much, Vincent. I'm going to hand over to you now, and I think you've got some slides to share.
Thank you, Laura, and thanks for having me. I'm going to start sharing my screen, which hopefully I will get right. One moment. Great. So currently on screen is a blue slide. It's with the title Doing Equitable Leadership in the Arts, and my name, Vincent Silk. Before we start, I would like to, of course, acknowledge country. I am currently an uninvited guest on Kulin land, so I'm acknowledging the country that I'm on as the land of the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, and I want to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and future. And I also want to acknowledge that this land was invaded and that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have resisted the occupation of their lands for over 230 years, and to stand in solidarity with that as we are talking about hierarchy and the impacts of it on our lives today. So on screen at the moment is a slide reading Acknowledgement of Country with an Aboriginal flag. So today is quite different to other things that I'm used to facilitating. So bear with me. Usually I'm a bit more interactive and would be able to engage questions and participate in the art of dialogue, which is the greatest art of all time. But I'll tell you a little bit about what we're going to be doing today. So on the screen at the moment is another blue slide with an apple, a picture of an apple, a line drawing in red with carrying a cartoon of a rolled up piece of paper. So what I was thinking today is it's not going to be possible to speak to every example or situation of the way that power structures we have to engage with them in our lives. So there's going to be things that we leave out or don't get to. My main interest is to share some examples of things that I've learned and to think about how we might go about engaging critical thinking about leadership, particularly as it relates to gender and as it relates to power. And yeah, really I hope that people can apply this quite broadly to their work in the arts. So first of all, I guess we'll start talking about our context, the context within we make work and live our lives. And then I'm going to move on to share a few frameworks for talking about and thinking about hierarchy. I'll explain more about why that's a useful framework that I've found as we go into it. Then we'll be talking about creating networks of solidarity. So what that might look like, what it requires for us to be able to rely on each other, what things are generative, what things are supportive, and how we can go about creating these networks informally and also formally in our organizations. And I think I was really hoping to have some reflection time at the end about what it actually takes and requires and what makes change possible. And then we will talk a bit, I'll offer some resources. So, so there will be opportunities throughout the presentation to like chime in the chat, and I really, really welcome any, any feedback or anything like that as we go along. So who am I? Currently on the screen is a half and half slide. On one half of the page, it has a blue background and says, who am I? On the other half of the page, there's a picture of me. I'm a fair-skinned man. I'm 30 years old. And in the picture, I'm wearing a pink polar fleece shirt and I'm standing in the trees. This photo was actually taken on the country where I grew up, which is the Central Coast on Darkinjung land, and it was taken in October last year when my partner and I went for a holiday. And I live in Melbourne, so I'm thinking very fondly of a time when I was able to go more than 5 kilometers from my home, and I'm really missing that time. I guess to tell you a bit about me and I suppose why me? Why I'm here talking about this particular topic. I'll tell you a bit about my work. So as Laura mentioned, I've spent a large chunk of the last decade kind of doing a lot of community organising around community education. A lot of that has involved the prevention of violence and sexual assault in a community organisation called Undercurrent Victoria. Looking at education that creates transformative change in people's hearts and minds and social groups has been a really big part of my practice and has been something that my creative practice has also involved. My professional work has involved a lot of work with teenagers and a lot of work with young men. And if we're going to be talking about gender and the things that I have found most, I suppose, generative and transformative for myself, I feel very honoured to have had some really beautiful conversations with teenage boys about ways that they, without even necessarily having the language for it, challenge patriarchy in their everyday lives. So that's been a really big part of my work in the last 5 to 10 years. I've also, I suppose, some other things that I feel maybe inform my practice. I've done a lot of work in behaviour change. So I worked as a men's behaviour change facilitator, which is work with primarily heterosexual men who have used violence against female partners and kids, and as well as having worked in behaviour change programs for LGBTIQ people who have used violence in relationships. That's been part of my professional work for a few years now. I currently work as a counsellor. So I suppose that I have quite a bit of everyday life thinking about what creates change, what change means, and the ways that power impacts our lives. So I'm thinking about this stuff quite a lot. I guess my creative work is very relevant, even though sometimes it's quite easy to forget that your creative work is relevant when you're very isolated from everything else around you. But I think it's worth mentioning that, yeah, my creative work is mostly in writing, particularly writing fiction and like arts writing. So the book that I published in 2018, a lot of my focus in that book was really thinking about this stuff, about communities and about change and about the ways that we can have like joy and fun while also, smashing the state. The last thing I'll mention is that it's maybe worth mentioning that I'm a transgender person. So if we're going to be talking about gender, I suppose I think I've spent a long time reflecting on the ways that that gender shows up in my life and the ways that gender is both enacted upon me and all of us, and the ways that I've navigated my different experiences of gender and being gendered throughout my life and interpersonal relationships and my career. So that's me. So now let's talk about context. So the slide on the screen at the moment contains a line drawing of a castle with a moat around it and with clouds in the sky, and a heading reading, "What's our context?" The text on the screen reads, "Our organisations and institutions exist in hierarchical systems. We make art, exhibit, publish, perform, and relate to each other within these systems. Our work is made on stolen land. How do we want to challenge hierarchy, and what makes it possible to do so?" So I suppose in thinking about this, when I was preparing for this presentation, I was thinking, you know, if we're going to talk about gendered leadership in arts communities and organisations, and if we're going to talk about leadership and gender anywhere really, we can't really do that without talking about white supremacy and without talking about race and racialization and racial harm. And I'm not going to pretend that I'm the most qualified or most appropriate person to be doing, you know, community education or a webinar about the impacts of white supremacy in the arts. Being a white settler on this land, I think that is that's something that I'm really conscious of, but I'm not the best placed person to perhaps talk about that. So what I do want to do is share some resources in this presentation looking at addressing white supremacy culture in organisations and institutions. That's work that's been done for many, many years by people of colour, and work that has been really integral as part of a collective knowledge base for communities and organisations that I've been a part of. So I will share some of that as we go along. I wanted to also make a note, you know, that this, if we're going to be talking about gender and power, I think we can safely assume that we're often either rubbing up against or touching on experiences of harm, whether that's, you know, like experiences of feeling uncomfortable around certain people or something like this in your organisation, or, you know, direct experiences of harassment or misgendering or this kind of thing. So I wanted to really reiterate what Laura was saying, that if anything comes up for you or feels hard to think about, or, you know, just takes you out of your comfort zone, really feel free to take a break or to leave the webinar. And I really invite everybody to check in with people or like reach out for help if you want to. There's going to be some resources shared. But yeah, this is, nobody experiences harmful gendered interactions alone. So nobody should have to deal with them alone. I think that's something really important to mention. I guess that when I was thinking about diversity and the context that we're in, if we're talking about transformative change in our organisations, the thing that came to my mind as being most relevant was this quote by Angela Davis. She says, "I have a hard time accepting diversity as a synonym for justice. Diversity is corporate strategy." And so I wanted to think about that and think about the ways that, rather than, as Auntie Angela says, just absorbing those who were previously excluded into our organisations or systems that are just as racist, just as misogynistic and homophobic and transphobic as they were before, rather than just absorbing those people in, how can we bring about structural change? And thinking about how we do that in our relationships seemed to me the most appropriate way forward. I do think that it is quite difficult to do this kind of work in institutions, but I don't think that means that one should not do it, or that it's not worth doing. I think that my main thinking with this webinar today was to explore possibilities for critical thinking, and to give some frameworks and give some options at how artists and arts workers can use frameworks to connect in solidarity with each other. So I'm going to talk a bit about hierarchy. So on the screen at the moment is a blue slide. There's a yellow triangle. The triangle, at the top of the triangle, there's words saying who is up here. In the middle of the triangle, it says who is here in the middle. And at the bottom of the triangle, it says who is here. And then we've got some questions in a box on the side of the screen. So I'll tell you a little bit about why I have put this, this very simplistic diagram as a framework for thinking about hierarchy. So in men's behavior change work, we actually use this activity to explore or open up men's thinking about hierarchy and about what it is and how it impacts our lives. The way that we often do it is to start by talking about economic hierarchy. So with economic hierarchy, it would be, one would ask, okay, so in the system of capitalism, in economic hierarchy, who is at the top? And people would often say, oh, CEOs or people in government or politicians, and you know, people with a lot of money and with a lot of power. And then we might ask, okay, so who's here in the middle? And people might have really different views about that. So it can be useful to kind of explore what those views are, I guess, and explore why we have those views. And then thinking about who's at the bottom. This can be a really interesting place to explore ideas about the way that people see themselves, I suppose. So often starting with economic hierarchy creates a framework for people who might not think of themselves as having much power in the world, say like a man who is controlling in his family. He might, in a sense of economic hierarchy, see himself as quite low in a hierarchy. So he might see himself down the bottom being quite oppressed by his boss, the fact that he needs to pay rent, this kind of stuff. So the reason why I wanted to give this kind of framework is that it's an interesting way to think about how we think about ourselves and other people. And I think that doing this as an activity, perhaps like in friendship groups or like with your studio mates or in an arts organization, particularly among people on the same level, could be quite interesting. It's an interesting way for, say, managers to be able to understand something about difference in power. And I've put on the side of the slide some common questions that we might ask, and they're really just meant to be reflective questions. So you could ask these for anyone at any place in this triangle. So if we're thinking about the people who are at the top of a hierarchy, what do they think about themselves? Often people might say, oh, they think they deserve to be there. What do they think about people in other positions? They also think they deserve to be there. And then thinking about the question, what do they do, is really important. I think that if we're thinking about what does somebody do, it's about like actions, right? So something like, what do they do? My thinking on that is often, okay, they make decisions about where money goes, which leads me to the next question. What kind of decisions do they have control over? Who makes decisions about them? And what happens when these people don't get their way? What kind of things get said about these people? And the reason why I started with these questions for this presentation was that they're all applicable to anyone in any place if we're talking about hierarchy. So talking about thinking about gender and gendered hierarchies in organizations. I guess I often think about, money. Who makes decisions within organizations about what gets funded? Who makes decisions about what gets done with that funding? Who makes decisions about who we're accountable to? Are we accountable to our funders, or are we accountable to the people who come to our galleries, or are we accountable to the people who are in our extended network interpersonally. I wish that I could now ask everyone if that makes sense, but I can't. So maybe we'll have to talk about it later in the chat. I did want to touch on the next thing I want to touch on is how this kind of stuff can show up in interpersonal relationships. So these same kind of things in this next slide. There's the same triangle with who is up here, who is down here, who's in the middle. And I did add the question, is anyone in the middle? Sometimes it doesn't feel like anyone is in the middle, but sometimes if we're talking about organizations and like communities of practice, there are people who are in the middle and who juggle power really differently. There are some questions on the side of the slide, and I think I'll read them out. So how do decisions get made? What happens if this person makes a mistake? Who does this person answer to? What happens when this person gets angry? What does that look like? And what does conflict look like when we disagree? I think for me, the things that stick out here as being quite important questions is what happens if this person makes a mistake? There's something about the way that power kind of operates in organizations in a particularly gendered way, where mistakes can come to stand in for like the entirety of a person. And I think that this is a really important thing to touch on when we're talking about what hierarchy actually looks like in interpersonal relationships. What disagreeing with each other looks like. Is there ways to disagree with each other and never reach a resolution, and to do that while also respecting each other? I think that using a framework like this to organize, like within a friend group, or to organize within a group of people at a studio and address conflict. For example, if, you know, there are really specific situations that arise where like somebody, like one person or a group of people might be like excluding somebody else, or might be causing some sort of harm to somebody else. And if we want to actually work out what's happening and the ways that power is informing these things, we can kind of look at who has control over the decisions. What do people usually say about the decisions that that person makes? What do people say about what it looks like when that person gets pissed off? That kind of thing can be quite helpful. I think when I was thinking about, you know, ways to make this framework more useful for people in the arts, I was thinking about particularly about money, like who gets to make decisions about money, who decides how much time and work is put into a project and decides what we work on, how do we decide what feels comfortable to joke about, who do we answer to, how do we want to talk to each other, and what happens if somebody doesn't express themselves in the way that everybody else thinks that they should. So they're kind of open questions for everybody. So this slide there's a title that says Sharing Power. And I want to acknowledge, and there's a yellow circle on the side, which is a stand-in for a sharing of power that doesn't look like a triangle. So I guess I wanted to acknowledge that sometimes we don't exist in hierarchical systems. Like sometimes we have really effectively worked out how to share power in our relationships. And I would invite people to ask themselves, where did you learn how to do that? Where did you see that? How did the decisions get negotiated when we share power? And what happens when people disagree, or when they make a mistake, when power is shared? And I was thinking here about a story that somebody who I worked with told me about, you know, that he had seen his grandmother being a very non-hierarchical figure in his family growing up. and that power was very shared, and that was how he learned to negotiate decisions without using any kind of like power over. So in this slide has a title saying creating networks of solidarity in yellow, and there's a diagram that says pod mapping with the words resources, movable, orgs and groups, networks, and pod in circles. I wanted to talk about the idea of solidarity, particularly, and I've shared some resources about this later in the presentation, but particularly about the idea of a solidarity team, which comes from activist and therapist Vicky Reynolds. She mentions solidarity teams as being an important part of like being ethical and managing to stay ethical in things that are important to you. I have shared a resource as well called Pod Mapping from the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective. This is a resource that is aimed at helping us identify what we already have available to us, because we do have heaps of resources already available to us. It doesn't always involve the HR department at our workplace. Sometimes it can involve neighbours or people who you share spaces with. It can involve all manner of people, really. And so I have shared I've shared a resource about this that people might want to look into a little bit further. So this slide, it says creating networks of solidarity, and has a number of questions on them that I'll read out after explaining a bit about solidarity teams. So Vicky Reynolds is a therapist who makes a lot of connections between activism and therapy, and sees those two things as fundamentally linked. And I suppose has been a big part of my inspiration for me, thinking about the ways that like creative practice can also involve activism or can involve challenges to power. So I'll read out the questions for you. Who would you like to invite to your solidarity team? What qualifies them to be in solidarity to you? What ethics, resources, ideas, values, and interests connect you to them? How are you going to engage members of the team with whom you have no physical or spoken contact? So this last question particularly, I wanted to acknowledge that like sometimes members of the team that we have who's in solidarity with us are historical. So it could be, as I was speaking about that person's grandmother before, it could be your grandmother. It could be somebody who you learned non-gendered leadership from, or somebody who's like a great inspiration to you, or you know, someone like one of my very good friends puts Mariah Carey on her solidarity team because of the sheer like feminist and intertextual genius of the song Obsessed, how when she's cosplaying as Eminem, and I think that's one of the great interventions of this century into like a culture of masculinity and a culture of misogyny, is that video clip. So I was very inspired by her creative use of the solidarity team. This question of who would you like to invite to your solidarity team, I guess it's a really big one. How do we know that somebody is going to have solidarity with us? How do we know who we can talk to? I suppose that my interest in this was to create ideas about how we might go about talking to each other, particularly about stuff that's difficult and about things that we want to challenge. So I have shared a list of questions that are at the end of this presentation that people can look at further for more, I guess, more insight. So this slide reads, what do we want to keep and what can go? I think these are questions that I found very important. part of these other questions read, how do we want the people that we work with to feel? How do we want to feel? And where else do we see the leadership that we want to emulate? I think when I was thinking about this, I thought, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are many ways that I've seen leadership done that are not hierarchical and not about having power over somebody. And some of the ways that I've thought about that is to think, well, how did that person make me feel? And how did I let them know that I felt supported or validated or enriched by their contact with me? And what is it that in me that they inspired or woke up? And how can I support that in other people that I work with or that I have contact with? I'm really interested in this idea of what do we want to keep, because it doesn't all suck. Like what we have is there's heaps of things about the ways that we, particularly, with power and hierarchy, have learned to interact with each other. And some of them can go, some of them we don't need, but some of them are actually, very, very generative and very powerful, and keep us sane and keep us in this together. The last slide here, it has a picture of Wile E. Coyote painting a road on the wall of a mountain. And it reads, what gets in the way? What's going to work? How does change happen? And who are we accountable to? The reason I was looking at this picture was because I was reading a poem the other day, and I again can't remember the name of the poet or the poem, but the only quote I remember is, "Door in the mountain, let me in." And I was thinking about the way that we sometimes, it's almost like we're running into this mountain over and over again, like this insurmountable mountain of inequality and gendered bullshit and power struggles. And in some ways, making changes to that feels like painting a door on a mountain to get through it. And so I wanted to think about what the things are in the mountain. What is the mountain made of? And of course, it's made of, power and power structures. And I think it's the other things that I thought it's also made of is, defensiveness and lack of accountability and really rigid adherence to gendered stereotypes or very rigid ways of being, and also the sheer weight of patriarchal culture and racism and misogyny that kind of bears down on us as though it were a mountain. And I guess that thinking about staring up at that mountain, I thought, well, what's going to work? And something that I wanted to bring to this is thinking about if we know what's going to work in order to make change, then we can develop a theory of how change is going to happen. So commitment to changing the culture of our organizations and friendship groups and galleries and studios and people who we work with. It maybe takes a lot, but I think that there's something really important there about doing it together. So I think there needs to be like organizational commitment, as well as commitment of people. So the next slide is about resources, but I wanted to maybe leave this slide on the screen and hand it over to Frances to take some questions from the chat. Is that okay, Frances?
Hi, Vincent. I'm going to do the questions, if that's
okay.
all right.
Yep, no worries. Thanks, Laura.
Thank you. Wow, so many good questions. So many things to think about. Thank you for sharing that all with us. If you do have a question for Vincent, please add it into the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom, and we'll do our best to answer as many as we can. I am just going to start with a question to get us going. I guess all of these questions, you know, they're quite reflective on our own personal understandings, but I guess I'm interested in what happens next. How do we then go into our organizations and start to ask these questions or have these conversations? And what kind of advice do you have around that next step?
Yeah, I think that's a really a very good question, a very valid question, and something that I think part of the reason why I wanted to share frameworks rather than like anecdotes or personal advice is that doing something like an activity about how hierarchy shows up in your organization, I think is really useful. And I think it's a really useful thing to do in small teams, particularly where people are all on the same level. So I work in an organization where I'm on the same level as a number of other workers, and then there's a management team, and then there's a manager, similar to many other people, I'm sure. Or probably many other people have many, many layers of bureaucracy between them and whoever's in charge. I think that organizing some sort of like professional development time or reflective practice time, which is what we call it in, counseling and those kind of professions, I think is really valuable. And doing physical activities together, even though in this time you have to do it on Zoom. I think doing these things together and actually finding out what each other's values are and what makes it difficult to talk about this stuff and actually addressing that, I think makes a lot of headway into that kind of passive aggressiveness and silence that we see a lot of the time in Australia, everywhere. Yeah. Hopefully that answers your question, Laura.
That is a great answer. Thank you. We have another question that's come through. Sorry, that's a plane going over my house. What should you do if you feel intimidated by your male boss, but you also know they hold a lot of sway in the industry, both inside and outside your institution?
What should you do? Well, firstly, I want to say that sucks, and I'm really sorry, and that's not an empty kind of offer of sympathy either. That's an acknowledgement that that's a real thing that happens when we're talking about like gendered power. Yeah, men intimidate women and people of other genders all the time, particularly with impunity a lot of the time, and in our organizations particularly. I guess that my suggestions, my practical suggestions would be to consider who it is if there's anybody that you could talk to, or that you could I guess share that experience with, and to share that experience with them, whether that's like a friend or somebody who you trust, or somebody in the organization. I think it's really difficult to make complaints. Complaints can change stuff, but they also can not do anything. I guess that there's a big tension here around like, how do we change culture without actually like fighting for it? But then what does it require? I wonder if there's some ways to, have solidarity with other people, perhaps who aren't men, or who share a gendered experience with you, and to talk to them about it, and maybe find out if that male boss also makes them uncomfortable. Sometimes this stuff is an open secret in our industries, and sometimes it just feels like a secret that we're holding and that nobody else knows about. My advice is always to talk to other people, because there's way more strength in numbers. I think I've gone on enough about that. Yeah.
I think that, yeah, I think if you're having an experience, chances are someone else is having an experience as well.
Mm.
Good to talk about it. Thank you. Thank you for answering that. I think we've got one more question and then we're going to wrap it up. One practical tip to leave us with on how we can challenge these structures and these power dynamics. Is there something that you can leave us as a takeaway?
One. Okay. Well, I think one practical tip.
Okay. Or a tip, if not the one.
Yeah. Well, I guess, I mean, the first thing I'm thinking is it's different, right? It's different for whoever you are, because, you know, say the person who very generously just asked that question, the previous question, I'm thinking, yeah, the practical tip that I would give you is really different to the practical tip that I would give your male boss. To your male boss, I would say, pay attention to what you're doing and pay attention to how you're making people feel, and then think about whether or not you give a shit, and if you don't, think about why and what that actually means about how you experience the world. But to that person who asked that question, I wouldn't necessarily give the same tip. I might say something like, think about, I would invite you to think about the amazing like resources of strength that you've already drawn on to get you through an experience that's really uncomfortable and that you shouldn't have to experience. So yeah, they're not really practical tips, are they?
No, I think that's really good, and I think I thank you for your time and for asking us all of these, or inviting us to ask ourselves these questions. And I really hope that everybody with us today and watching the recording asks themselves whatever questions are relevant to them and to their practice and to their organizations in whatever situation they may find themselves in. So thank you really for opening that up to us and encouraging us to really reflect on what we're doing and how we're feeling and how we're behaving. So thank you, Vincent. Thank you for your time. If you have a question and we haven't got to it, you can always send us an email and we can pass it on. And yeah, this is our last session. So thank you for everybody for coming. Thank you to all of the presenters. I can't name all of them because there's over 40 who have presented over the past few months. To our Auslan interpreters, I think we've had over 10 interpreters work so hard with us over all of these sessions. To Red Bee Media as well, who has done all of our captioning for each session. And to our team, Kevin, Francis and Ian, who have put in so much time and energy in bringing these sessions out every week. And of course, to everybody that's come, to everybody that's connected and shared their experiences and come together in this absolutely wild time that we're all in. So yeah, a big thank you. And a reminder, if you haven't, to take a couple of minutes to fill out the survey so that, of course, we can continue to do programs that are useful and practical and helpful and supportive. So again, Vincent, thank you. What a great way to end this series. And yeah, so many good things to think about how we exist in this world. So thank you. And that's it.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye, everyone. I'll see you again.